All right, welcome. My name is Christian Flachsland. I'm a professor of sustainability at the Hertie School, and I'm also director of the Hertie School Center for Sustainability. I'm your host and moderator for today's event on Russia's war on Ukraine and energy policy response options for Germany and the European Union. And this event is part of the Hertie School's event series, Hertie Talks Ukraine, in which we discuss the Russian war on Ukraine from a variety of angles. I'm very glad to welcome our panelists. Ingrid Nestle from the Green Party in Bundestag, speaker for energy and climate policy. Our very own Marina Henke, director for our Center for International Security and professor at the Hertie School, and Leon Hirt, professor of energy policy and colleague of mine at the Center for Sustainability. So let me start with a few framing remarks for our discussion. So first of all, I really just said to Ingrid, I find that such public discussions more valuable than ever, as we are facing these fundamental political, economic, and also military changes unfolding before our eyes at pretty rapid speed. And to be honest, at least in the field of climate policy over the past years, I've not been such a big fan of public discussion at some point because you could always predict what people were saying on the panel because things didn't move very much. Now this is very different. I don't know what Marina, Ingrid, and Leon will be saying. And I'm very much looking forward to that discussion and to learning from that. And I'm learning from these discussions a lot in the recent weeks. Roderich Kiesewetter unfortunately had to cancel his participation on very short notice. I think you'll see him on TV tonight. So let me briefly start with a quick framing on three intersections of policy fields that emerge from the Russian war. There are many of these intersections, but three that perhaps also could frame our discussion a little bit. So the first one is basically domestic energy policy, which has been changing fundamentally even prior to the start of the war. So we were already wondering about low gas storage filling in Germany at fall, the latest, I would say, and when Gazprom effectively stopped delivering gas beyond long-term contracts. Some people noticed, but certainly markets noticed, prices for gas roared, for electricity, and for other energy carriers, and we've seen unprecedented price increases and price swings. And as a consequence of that, we have a major debate on how to deal with the social industrial fallout of all that, of these very high energy prices. The German and the other EU governments have implemented immediate relief packages, and there are proposals for further implementing compensation schemes or even energy wholesale market price caps. And these discussions are in full swing, and I think they will be one part of our discussion today. But beyond these domestic energy market debates, of course, with the start of the Russian war on 24th February and these horrible atrocities in the Ukraine that we see and are documented by Human Rights Watch and other documentations that we can actually watch live almost on social media, we have this very fierce debate over energy sanctions against Russia as part of a broader package of sanctions from the security perspective. And as we all know, Germany finds itself in this position of being highly dependent on Russian gas imports, with 40 to 55% dependence over the past 5 years, depending on the numbers, but finding it very hard to wean it off quickly from that. Germany is also reluctant to support an oil embargo, where substitution is actually easier, still quite challenging, of course, but world markets and infrastructures offer a bit more flexibility. And a coal embargo has been adopted by the EU, taking effect in summer, when substitution can be achieved, likely without major disruptions. But also this will not have severe effects on the Russian economy. And then third, as a third development, and it's almost more of an upcoming development, and if we look at the war in Russia itself, it sometimes seems minor, but it's not minor in the sense that the climate crisis is the next big pressure, the next big crisis building up in the background slowly but steadily. This year was actually meant to be the year in which the European Union adopts its Green Deal climate policy agenda, right? Following the EU Commission's Fit for 55 policy package proposal summer last year, with proposals to tighten our emission trading systems, introducing a new emissions trading system, effectively phasing out fossil fuel consumption in the European Union with these tools, but over the time horizon of 20 years, plus minus a few years. And thus supporting weaning off fossil energy imports from Russia in principle, but there are now also concerns that, well, we actually might not be able to afford this climate level of climate policy ambition anymore in some quarters in Germany and in Europe. And in face of the energy market crisis we face, and then also the investments into security that we're facing, and of course the fallout from COVID is still with us. So that's also an important debate that I think is building up in the background. Now, in today's panel discussion, we want to address these and other topics at the intersection of security, energy, and climate policy from the German and European angle. I could hardly imagine a better group of speakers to come together and share their views and discuss their views. And with that, let's straight jump into our first round of interactions. So I'll first ask Marina, then Leon, and then Ingrid to share their views on current developments. So I will ask them questions and ask them to give a 5-6 minute input, and then we'll have a panel debate, and then have a Q&A with the audience, roughly half an hour or so. Please share your questions in the Q&A or F&A if you have the German version of Zoom here. I'll be very happy to pass these on to the panel that we have. Okay, so Marina, and I want to give the full introduction so people who don't know you yet know who you are. Marina is our professor of international relations, and as I've said, our director of the Center for International Security. She researches and publishes on military interventions, peacekeeping, nuclear security, and European security and defense policy. And before joining the Hertie School, she was a tenured associate professor at Northwestern University, specializing in international relations, and she also taught at Princeton. So I'm very glad that we have Marina at the Hertie School, and I think the appointment couldn't have been more timely given the current developments. Marina, 3 questions to you, and these are broad questions, and 6 minutes are not sufficient, but nevertheless, I know that you can respond to such questions very well in a short period of time. First, can you start by giving us your broader assessment and outlook on the Russian war from a security, military, perhaps also diplomacy perspective? And that, building on that, can you elaborate a bit on your view on the role of energy trade between Germany, EU, and Russia, and how that also constrains perhaps the German government options and room for maneuver on the field of diplomacy and security responses? And then finally, quite specifically, do you have a view on whether Germany and the EU should adopt some kind of energy trade embargo or perhaps tariff on Russian coal, oil, or gas? And perhaps also, if you have thoughts and instruments and timeframes, I would be very interested in your views from the security community. And I will ask that last question also to the other panelists, and let's see what the positions are here. Marina.
Thank you so much, Christian, for this very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. You know, another one of these, I think, highly timely events on the Ukraine crisis. So let me give you just a very broad overview of what's actually happening in Ukraine as we speak. So a second phase of the war has started. One can say that Russia has recognized that they made mistake in this first phase that started on February 24th. So the mistakes were that they had underestimated Ukrainian defenses. They had also overestimated their own logistics capabilities. They had overestimated their own command capabilities and also their own communication capabilities. And so they completely, to a certain degree, reconfigured their campaign. And now they are focusing on, their definition of the Donbass, so how they, interpret it always in their public speeches of the areas that are basically occupied by the Russian speakers or the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. So how does this area more or less look like? This is kind of an inverse C shape from Kharkiv to Kherson, if you can see this, or like a half moon that is eastern Ukraine. And it would also, of course, assure this land bridge to Crimea, especially in the south. So it would cover this entire stretch from the Russian border to then, the Crimea Peninsula. So this new phase in the war tries to use Russian strength and exploit Ukrainian weaknesses. So how did Russia interpret its, kind of somewhat first failed attempt of taking at least Kiev? Well, Ukraine turned out to be really good in guerrilla tactics. So that's close combat, and to a certain degree, this is hide and seek. So the Ukrainian forces were able to hide either in forests or in other kind of hilly territory, and this is kind of especially the territory north of Ukraine, or then of course as well in certain kind of urban or suburban territory, and then come out with these kind of close combat weapons. So here we speak of the Stinger weapons, of javelin weapons, but also grenades. Of course, they were in their tactics. They were helped a lot by mostly kind of NATO-provided intelligence. They were able to hack into communication systems. They had a lot of kind of difficulties with command. So there were several generals, and I can get into the details of how the command structures, in Russia looks like, and what kind of mistakes were made, and like what kind of lessons were drawn from this first phase and applied in the second. So in the second phase, at least from a Russian perspective, they really want to build on their strengths. And so what are their strengths? Basically, they're opting for a terrain or a battle space which is open. So picture fairly large plains with only fairly small village type of structures, where basically guerrilla tactics don't work. So the Ukrainian forces can no longer do this kind of like hide and seek tactic. So they can, they have to open, so they have to operate in a pretty open space. And here is, where the Russians can use especially their technological capabilities. So that's, for example, their Panzer tank divisions. And the idea is that they can occupy this space pretty quickly. And, and that's why also maybe now this makes for some of the people in the audience a lot of sense, why the Ukrainians are so desperately begging for this heavy weaponry, because everything that has been delivered so far was kind of fairly small and especially close combat, meaning, guerrilla or counterinsurgency kind of weaponry. And now they really need to hit those Russian tank divisions in particular from a very long distance, because they cannot go, any closer otherwise, and they will be found. That means they need to have long distance artilleries. They need to have themselves those tanks. They need to have fighter jets so that they can bomb and so forth. And this is exactly what they're asking for. And, as many of you know, Germany has, for various reasons, difficulties providing it. What are my expectations? Well, Mariupol has de facto fallen. And now the big question is, what will they do with Kharkiv? There is a possibility that basically they will not take Kharkiv and they will kind of exclude it from their zone. Right now, what people think, like Russians still want to take is just plain territory. That's the area from a city called Izium to then Donetsk city. So it's a little bit of a corner. And then in the big picture of things, they would have increased their territory, or like this Russian-speaking territory, how they call, by about 2/3 from what they had before. And in particular, as I mentioned before, they actually then would have this land bridge connecting Russia and Crimea. And if they are so there are certain expectations that Putin is he really pressed in time, and that he wants to declare at least like a first preliminary victory, and by May 9th, which is the famous Victory Day in Russia, which actually still dates back from the Second World War. Of course, there will be then a third phase, so it is possible that they can take this territory, and the second phase can be, there is a probability that it's, they can be victorious, especially because they're actually really playing with their strength, and, and they did detect and I think understand the weaknesses of the Ukrainian military quite well. But of course, there will be a third phase, and this will be then just like the contestation of this territory that they have been taken. But, maybe I should stop here just for the update. So, You also ask about the role of energy policy and how it puts constraints on German and EU policy responses towards the Ukrainian crisis, and then, my opinion on an embargo. So, of course, it put constraints on EU and German policy. But, I think most of the constraints were actually prior to the war starting, right? Germany and Europe massively, and let me highlight this, massively failed at deterring Russia. I'm convinced that this was actually a deterrence failure, so that Russia could have been deterred if the right messages were sent, but they were not sent until, like a couple of days prior to this invasion. Still in Germany, people had huge difficulty even mentioning Nord Stream 2 or mentioning, like the set of sanctions. Deterrence, how does deterrence work? You put it all on the table and you say, like, this is the sanction package that we will actually implement, and if you cross that line, we will do it. Deterrence is not about we don't know, maybe we're going to do about something about this, and like all this kind of fiddling that happened in the European context. And now we know, partly from intelligence sources, but that Putin interpreted this fiddling as especially that the Germans and the French would not respond in force. Of course, he miscalculated, but still in the big picture of things, if we, I think we first have to look at ourselves. What were our mistakes? And our mistakes were at the German government, that it fundamentally underestimated, actually the meaning of deterrence. So let me briefly respond to the question of embargo, because I think it's a very important question, and, you have to look at it from different perspectives. So to a certain degree, I personally, of course, have a normative perspective on it. And I think, you should not by any means support that war in Ukraine. And so from a normative perspective, I would say, yes. But, I'm also a political scientist. And so from this perspective, you need to understand whether actually all of these sanctions work, and like, what does work mean? That they in one form or another trigger a change in Russian behavior. And the change in Russian behavior, if sanctions are supposed to work properly, either happens at the elite level, that elite circles around Putin turn against him, or that there is really kind of like a grassroots movement, and that the population turns against him. And so far, we have not seen both developments. Actually, to the contrary, the public opinion approval of Putin has increased. And I know probably your immediate reaction is, can you trust any opinion polls in Russia? But to a certain degree, there are still certain centers, and particularly the Varda Center, that is still conducting these polls, and they have a very, very good reputation. And they have detected that there's, in the big picture of things, a support. And why? And of course, this is the answer, because media are extremely controlled, and this narrative that Putin is telling, and all the media telling, that this is, a mission that is protecting these Russian-speaking minorities, that they are under threat, that, NATO wants to destroy Russia, is very potent and is widely believed. So the big question that we need to ask, if you now have this, embargo going, will this not only reinforce this narrative? Because of course, people in Russia are suffering. Probably they're suffering less than people so far have anticipated. So the ruble, to a certain degree, has gained again in value after a very sharp drop. But of course, foreign companies are closing their production sites. You have supply chain difficulties, all of these repercussions. And, and constantly there's discussion as well that Russia is going bankrupt, and they have serious economic difficulties. But still, all of this, is one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, does it trigger any political change? What we are actually really interested, because there have been instances of countries, look at Iraq under Saddam Hussein, look also at Iran to a certain degree, that have been under extremely harsh sanctioning regimes, and still there was no political change. And I think, if you really want to decide on these embargo questions, then we always need to also take into account, does it actually lead to what we want? And this is then, the actual political change. And of course, this is, there is no perfect answer to this, it cannot be said it will trigger that change or not, and it might increase the likelihood of further sufferance and then political change. But all we can say so far, the sanction regime has already been, relatively harsh. Of course, it would have been harsher with the energy sector as well. And in contrast of like a real strong political movement against, despite the repression, we do not see that. We actually see further support of Putin. And I think that's quite important. Okay, I think my 6 minutes are up, but I'm of course looking forward to further questions.
They are. Thanks a lot, Marina, for these insightful comments in that first round. My next question go to Leon. Leon is an assistant professor of energy policy at the Hertie School, and we work closely in the Center for Sustainability. His research interests lie in the economics of wind and solar power, energy policy instruments, and electricity market design, also open data and open source modeling, but this is not what you're going to talk about in a second, Leon. You've been very engaged in the debate, public debate, but also policy debate of how to deal with the energy market fallout of the crisis in the recent weeks and months. And my three questions to you are: first, how would you characterize the main impacts on the EU and German energy markets and policy, and what are the key impacts you expect for the future? So where to look on the energy policy end of things. Then second, what measures should Germany and the EU be taking to prepare for potential embargo or also a Russian disruption, perhaps of oil and gas trade? And third, the embargo question: should we, Europe, Germany, implement some kind of embargo tariff on gas or oil in your view? Leon.
Good evening. Thanks for the kind introduction, Christian. Happy to share a few thoughts as they develop. Marina, I must admit, you put it so well, and the failure of the German government to deter Russia, or even try to deter, or even show that they understand the very concept of deterrence, the failure to do so it still makes me so upset. We talked about this prior to the war. You said it so clearly, it was so obvious, and it still is. And even looking back, I see very, very little actually understanding of the failures made. It is such a shame. But this is beyond my own expertise. Let me talk about energy markets and systems, and in the context of this crisis. So first, this crisis, the energy crisis, is way older than you may think. The Russia-inflicted energy crisis really started almost 1 year earlier than the war, than the assault. So while we were talking about an embargo for 3 months now, the Russian gas embargo really started almost 1 year ago, when Gazprom ran the European gas storages empty and reduced its supply to the European markets, driving up prices by hundreds of percent. It was in late July when July 2021, when European gas prices surpassed the all-time high dating back to the commodity frenzy of 2008. So to sum this up, I must admit, as an energy community, as an analyst community, we were all pretty naive. And I don't even mean the war. I mean the energy crisis precisely. I think Europe should have responded to this economic threat and economic assaults way earlier and independently, even without any security dimension. I think policy, but also the entire community failed quite miserably here. So what's the role of Russia as an energy producer and exporter? Russia is, globally speaking, the largest exporter of oil, if you include oil products. So it's ahead of Saudi Arabia, and the largest exporter of natural gas, plus number 3 on coal. So it's a huge commodity exporter. However, these products are differently important for the government. Oil is huge, gas is large, but coal is really small as a fraction of imports or export revenues, or as a fraction of government funds. What's also important to keep in mind is that coal and oil are global commodities where there's one world price and it's relatively easy to substitute suppliers. Gas is not. Natural gas is a regional commodity, so there's a European price that's mostly delinked, uncoupled from other prices in East Asia and the US. For Europeans, among these 3 commodities, the big problem is natural gas for that precise reason, because it cannot easily be substituted. And we've seen wholesale prices going up from about 15 euros per megawatt hour to about 100. We've seen peaks much higher, but 100 has been sort of the average of the past half year. So this is a 700% increase. And that increase is much, much, much larger than for oil or oil products. And the reason is that as Europeans, we have so difficulty switching to other suppliers because a lot of the imports, most of the imports are pipeline gas, and you can't substitute this because the pipeline is where it is. On the other hand, of course, that also makes Russia very dependent on Europe as an export market. Russia exports very little to China, and the prices they receive in China is only a fraction of the Europeans. So the gas money really comes from European pockets. So what needs to be done? How can we prepare? I think there's 3 important things to do. First is conserve energy, and that's certainly the most important thing in the field. And to this end, we need, even if they hurt, we need to allow high prices to work because this is the incentive, this is the instrument that make people and firms conserve energy. And secondary, we need to inform people about the importance and also the financial incentive to do so. And with a bit of not very convinced that this will work. I've heard lately that the German government is planning a public ad campaign along the lines of the COVID vaccination campaign to make people conserve energy. And this is not really what I mean. Second, we need to help protect vulnerable households and firms. And I repeat, vulnerable households, we don't need to protect everyone. I don't need cash to pay my energy bills, but other people do. And we should do this in a way that preserves the incentive to conserve energy, because this is the most important thing to do, which means target the measure and pay lump sum and don't subsidize energy. So pretty much the worst thing that you can do is subsidize gasoline and gas stations. That helps the rich and that drives up gasoline consumption. And that's, of course, the landmark policy of this government in that respect. Oh, to be fair, one of them. And third, we should try to reduce payments to Russia. And there's different options how this could be done, an outright energy embargo, but maybe smarter options include import tariffs or import price caps that could be implemented in many different forms. None of this is without difficulties and without the danger of supply drying up. But this is at least something we should aim for. So should we go for an embargo? I think this is a question that, frankly, I cannot answer as an energy researcher. That's not my expertise. I have a personal opinion on this, but this is not really what matters here. What is things to consider, in my view, is that we need to evaluate the impact of an embargo on the European economy, which is difficult enough. And we have to contrast this with the impact of an embargo on Putin's essentially calculus, which is even more difficult. And I do agree with what you said, Marina. The history doesn't show that any embargoes tight enough will always lead to regime change. Quite the opposite. But of course, there's also other mechanisms, right? If we just decrease the possibility to pay for imports and pay for technology and pay for weapons, that could also help. And of course, that's a form of deterrence. It just increases the price for future conflicts or for an escalation of the conflict. But we also need to consider the impact on other countries, which will suffer from high world market prices, right? Even countries that do not import a single drop of oil from Russia will pay a higher global price. And this is essentially why India is so concerned and why India has not joined the ranks of condemning Russia. The most important single reason, or there's probably two, is arms imports and oil imports. And weighting all this against each other and weighting the human suffering and future European security against these political and economic costs is an inherent political question that, as a scientist, as a researcher, I certainly cannot answer. I must say personally, and I will close with this, and this is a very strict personal sort of private opinion, I would be willing to pay a pretty high financial price to increase the probability for this war to stop sooner than later. And if it's only for me to be able to look in the mirror in the future and explain this to my children. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Leon. Thanks for the statements, and we'll come back to some of these questions, I think. Next is Ingrid Nestle. Dr. Ingrid Nestler, actually, who's currently head of the working group and spokeswoman for climate protection and energy for the Green Party parliamentary group in the Bundestag. Also a member of the Committee on Climate Protection and Energy. She actually studied energy and environmental management in Flensburg, did her PhD there, at the chair of Energy and Resource Economics. And in 2009, she switched from academia to politics, though, when she was elected to the Bundestag and was spokeswoman for energy industry for the Greens in the Bundestag until 2012. She then became state secretary for energy transition and technical environmental protection in Schleswig-Holstein from 2012 to 2017. And she's been a member again in the German Bundestag since 2017. Ingrid, if I may. So I basically asked the same questions to you as to Leon, but to respond to them from your political perspective. So first, what have been, in your view, the main impacts of the Russian attack in Ukraine, or even before, on EU and German energy markets and policy so far, and what do you expect for the future, or what are you in particular looking for at in the future? Second, how can we prepare for potential embargo or tariff? And third, what is your view on embargo and tariff? I expect the government position, but perhaps there are some nuances that you might want to formulate here.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation and for your very good introductory statements, Marina and Leon. As you said, I moved from academia to politics, and I guess I sometimes miss this clarity that facts are facts and that you can't get around them and that they matter. And yes, so thank you very much for giving this high quality input. And I will try not to repeat. There's nothing I disagree with, Leon, with what you said, Marina. This is not my part of work where you work, so I don't know very much about what you said. It was very interesting. Leon is closer to where I work, and yes, I will try not to repeat, because it's just like you said. Politics became really nervous beginning of the winter, I should say, because we realized that gas storage was so low, and that if we had a really cold winter, that this might be trouble, but did not yet realize the danger of Russia really going to war or not sending gas anymore. So it was more like a gas storage nervousness, which maybe is reflected in that we already have a law ready, finished on gas storage. It's like the first law we passed through Parliament that really addresses this issue of energy security. Yeah, and with of course, the high prices were also back then an issue, and even more now. We already have 2 packages that try to help people, and well, focus was first people. Now we have even 3rd package, kind of an industry package underway, trying to help the people cope with these really, really high prices. And I think even though we have been doing this, that a lot of people in this country have not yet realized how high the prices are, because the prices from the electricity markets, they do not yet, they haven't reached the households, or not all companies either, or gas prices. So I think we're still a little bit like in this trance, thinking, wow, this is expensive, not realizing that it is really expensive, you know, how expensive it is. And yeah, I absolutely share the goal, Leon, that you said, to protect the vulnerable. That's what we've always been fighting for. Give the money to those who need it, not just to everybody, to those who need it. At the end, yeah, I was really happy that we managed to get a package going where the poor people would get a little bit more than the rich people. And this maybe shows yeah, how poor social policy has been over the last decade, because this should be just natural. But there have been so many help packages where the rich in the end got more than the poor, that yeah, even this small change already made me happy. Well, that's the price issue. Now turning to really political perspective, what it also did was really increase the workload immensely in the energy policy field. We had, of course, a very, very packed agenda starting the new coalition because we really wanted to speed up renewables and the energy transition and get 80% renewables in 2030 and in the electricity sector and changes in the heat and transport sector as well and industry. And yeah, I think we would have been very, very busy without any crisis at all. And now I sometimes feel that the scarcest resource we are having at the moment is time of the people who can really take the political decisions and prepare them and make them well. And yeah, well, every hour we have in our lives, we can do something that seems to be very useful. Maybe to just give you a picture, we already finished the gas storage. We almost finished the reduction with the zero EEG money. We have the big Easter package that we plan for with renewables, but also grids and other energy economics issues. And at the moment we are planning for 8 more laws, one for energy security, one for liquefied natural gas, one for wind energy onshore, one to have a reserve for hard coal, one to make sure that we have less gas and more coal in electricity production, another for the energy economics law, an energy efficiency law, and to increase the speed of processes to plan new infrastructure. Yeah, this on top of the packages and everything really sets the limit to what we can do. Passing over to the sanctions, well, how can we prepare? Apparently, all this is part of the preparation. I think the best things to do is always to use less fossil fuels. We already planned on an immense increase of renewable production, so this is of course one part of it, but we can actually hardly speed it up over what we already planned in last fall, because we believe that renewables are the solution. There may be a few things in the planification processes where we can speed up things a little bit more now. Yeah, but it will not be the big plus. But I think that we can, in the reduction of consumption, that there's a lot that still can be done, and where we are discussing and working on different things to come up. And then there are also these really short-term things that mean just switch to other fossil fuels from other countries, and you've talked about that. And that's mainly what we do to prepare. I feel that it's so crucial to use the summer now. I mean, it feels like we're in a really bad situation, energy security-wise, but we have this huge present, and this is the summer. You know, we have a summer in which we will not get into deep trouble. You told us coal and oil are not as difficult as gas. Gas is the really difficult issue, and during the summer we will not have trouble with gas. If we don't get it from Russia, we will not be able to fill the storage, but we will not be in trouble either. So yeah, we have this time to prepare, which is, I really think is, you know, it's such a treasure to have it. And I'm not sure we're as yet making good enough use of it, because, well, I think that actually Minister Habeck is doing everything he can, but he can't do everything. You know, the whole society would need to work together to use this time. I mean, all the authorities who are there to give allowances for new and renewable projects, all the companies who are using electricity and gas and can reduce it, and yes, all the people in their homes with their cars. You know, there's so much we could do as society as a whole, and we're still a little bit in the sleepy, oh well, everything seems fine for us mode, where I would like us, you know, to make better use of the summertime. And even that Minister Habeck started the first, the Frühwarnstufe, how do you say that in English? The early warning mechanism in the Energy Security Act did not really, you know, I think bring the urgency of need for action really to all the people. Last point, and then I know that I've already talked a lot yet. Do I want an embargo or something like that? It was another question. Actually, well, we just mentioned gas. I really do think I'm really not in favor of a gas embargo at this point of time. mainly because we have no technical possibilities to reduce the consumption of households. And actually the building sector is the biggest consumer with probably the biggest potential for savings. The gas we get from Russia is as much as the entire industrial sector. And I'm just not sure how much we will, or I mean, it's more than the entire industrial sector, but what we can reasonably get through LNG, and then what is left over, what we still have to save. You know, it's like the entire industrial sector. And I wouldn't be so much in trouble if we say that they do 1/3 and the households do the rest, which would probably be okay, and nobody would need to freeze. But we have no political measures to make sure that happens. And yes, I would be in worry if we would shut down the gas-using industry, more or less. Coal and oil are the other two options. Actually, I think an oil embargo is more attractive than a coal embargo, although coal is now being underway. One thing you said, coal is little. Actually, I'm not even quite sure it will hurt Putin, because we have quite a few long-term contracts from times when coal was a lot cheaper, around 60 euro per ton. At the moment, we're almost 300 euro per ton. So if we don't buy it at 60, I don't know how much of it he will be able to resell at a much higher price than he has contracts with us. So yes, the oil embargo is kind of the thing to look for. And I think Leon put a few very important questions. What does it mean for the rest of the world? And yes, maybe I'm hoping, you know, that I have academia here. Maybe you can answer my questions. But probably that's, I think we have to better understand which fraction of the oil exports can we really reduce? What will this mean for the oil prices, for the global oil prices, and how much will Russia gain on what they still sell, because we can't put it on the embargo. That's what I would like to understand even better. But personally, I have I'm rather positive to enforce this way with a lot of decision. I'm not really scared of what will happen to our consumption side. I think we can deal with it. It will be tough, of course, yeah, but I don't think it will kill anybody, and the war is killing people quite a lot. So that should not be the point to deter from it. But we have to make sure it really hits the right place. Okay, that was a long talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Great, thank you, Ingrid. And at this point, I'd like to encourage the audience to start sharing any questions you might have to the panel. I would take the opportunity as a moderator to ask more questions that I'm really interested in. First to Marina again, and then to Leon and Ingrid. And to Marina will be more energy and security and politics, and to Ingrid and Leon more the climate energy nexus. Marina, the thing that I am puzzled with, and I'm asking myself what's going on, and many other people certainly are, how do you explain what appears to be a pretty hesitant position in the German Chancellery with Olaf Scholz with respect to, well, heavy arms supply, energy embargo, and even at the level of rhetoric? Is this a wrong perception in your view, or what is going on there? Are there doubts about effectiveness of measures, be it military or energy embargo, as we just sort of touched upon? Is it the fear to avoid to be drawn into the armed conflict over nuclear escalation, preparing for the day after, difficulty of breaking with the traditional policy of SPD vis-a-vis Russia, overall mental model for thinking about energy and security policy, short-term orientation toward voter preferences, which are perhaps less strategic, everything? I don't know, I'd be really interested in your opinion. And also the other, Ingrid and Leon, feel free to follow up on this, of course.
Yeah, Christian, you know, I wish I really had one answer. So I need to speculate a little bit, because it's, you know, it's kind of all over the place, what I hear coming out of, you know, mostly Berlin circles. I think a major factor is fear. It is fear. There is a real perception, and by the way, I think this is wrong, but there is a perception that this war could escalate. And if there is, you know, more heavy weaponry shipped to Ukraine, that somehow NATO or Germany becomes a party of the war. So for various reasons, I think that's wrong. The first reason is that Russia does not want a war with NATO. Okay, so there is a realization that they're pretty tied up in Ukraine right now. And there is also a realization that, oops, maybe really underestimated the Ukrainians. So Russia does not want a war with NATO. And I think that's very important. So any kind of explanation right now that says like they will escalate is maybe in, a long term, but that I think, we should not bank on or even consider. The second, one, which is kind of like a little bit of a different logic. If Russia really wanted that war with NATO, it could find a lot of ways. And it's not Germany, by the way, who will determine that. So the Americans are delivering a lot of weapons and helping on all sorts of ways with advisors and intelligence and you name it. You have the Brits, pretty heavily involved. You have, of course, the Baltics and the Poles and, like other Eastern Europeans being everywhere, they possibly can. So if Russia really wanted that war with NATO, it's not the Germans holding back or like the Italians and some others, who would basically make them think otherwise. And actually, it's kind of like an inflated perception of how important Germany is in that question, to be honest with you. So I think, it is a certain, as you all know, there is and I think this was, by the way, my understanding, one of the major drivers as well of Scholz's big Zeitenwende speech in the Bundestag was fear. He was in a briefing of NATO commanders at the highest level on that Friday just before, where nobody knew how Ukraine would fare. Nobody had an idea of the defenses. So there was a real anticipation that Russia might take Kiev in a couple of days, and then it might have been on some kind of hubris type of a campaign, and then moving forward and maybe even taking Moldova. That was in this particular moment when the speech was given. That was still a real possibility. Now it looks very different, but in that moment, it was a possibility. And my understanding is, and what I heard as well from various circles, that Scholz then consulted with people in the Bundeswehr, and they basically said that Germany had, for its own defense, and I'm not speaking of NATO defense, meaning having NATO forces, US forces, just German forces, very, very, very little to spare. And especially, when it came to missile defense and air defense systems, nothing. And they couldn't even protect the Bundestag themselves. So I'm not speaking of other forces. So I think in this sense, it was just a real shock, a realization, like to what a degree there was a lack of these forces. And I think that's something that is still very much driving this decision right now.
Thank you, Marina. And then I would like to ask two questions, or perhaps one thought first on the relation of climate and energy policy, like looking forward to Ingrid and Leon. So what I'm wondering about now is about synergies and trade-off between the measures that we can take now, short term, but also midterm. So first of all, it's obvious, like reducing fossil fuel consumption in Russia means, or reducing emissions means reducing fossil fuel consumptions. Means reducing fossil imports from Russia. That's okay, but it's not identical. Climate policy isn't security policy, right? And Ingrid, you mentioned some of the measures, so to use coal plants more than to reduce gas consumption. So of course, something you wouldn't have expected the Greens to say a year ago, but here we are. And also this is a short-term measure, and I don't think anybody thinks, I think that this is a big problem. When it comes to expanding LNG capacities and like building terminals as a strategic tool to be able to diversify and not to be trapped in a situation again where we already have a debate, right? When the environmental community opposing that. So I'd be interested in your view on that, because I think strategically it makes sense, since we cannot wean ourselves off gas altogether very quickly. I'd like to hear your thinking on this, or if you say, well, we're never going to import gas from Russia again, that's the plan, and so we don't even need LNG because we're never going to be in that situation anyways. But even then, I would ask myself, okay, then how do we get the gas that we still need? But actually, these are not my main concerns when it comes to trade-offs. My main concern is about institution building and the EU decisions on climate policy for the next 10 years. In particular, or reforms of our emission trading systems, or the introduction of a new one that is like the plan to put a price on emissions and a cap on emissions on fossil fuel consumption over the next 20 years, and the plan to phase it out, basically. And that plan is now under pressure. It's been under pressure before, actually, from the Green Party in the European Parliament to some extent for the ETS2 for transport and buildings, because other measures are preferred. At least it seems to me like that, in terms of like standards and perhaps also subsidies. And weakening that and that planning, weakening that policy infrastructure, I think, is the main risk now, that in this situation of concerns over affordability, we water this down. So I'd be very interested in your views, Ingrid, on that, and also Leon, if you could share your thinking on the synergies and trade-offs in energy and climate policy. And if you want to get back to the broader political issues on security, I'm also inviting you to share any thoughts. And then we'll get back to the audience. Ingrid, perhaps you want to start?
Too bad. I wanted to let academia first, but I will try, and then you can add some more facts on top, Leon. Well, yes, of course, I've been, well, climate policy was the reason that I really entered politics. That was an issue that I came across when I was still a student at school, not at university. We were starting demonstrations to encourage people to fight the climate crisis. And then we were maybe only 400 people. It was nothing like Fridays for Future, and it was not many people talking about it. But still, it's been the thing that has been carrying it for a quarter of a century. I've been working on this. And we finally got, the decision to move out of coal. And now, yes, it is really, really tough to see that now we're saying, oh, but these coal-fired power plants, they have to run more because we don't have the gas. But I can still support doing it as long as I feel that we are also having a better chance than before to have a good climate policy situation in 2030. Because I think in the really short run, yes, we're doing a lot of things that are difficult for climate policy, and coal is the worst. And LNG is not really great either. And then there are other things that are fossil and that maybe we don't like, but like they're now discussing to get more fossil gas from the North Sea, from too close to the national park, where personally I kind of think, well, that there must be a proper check to do it, not in the national park. But sometimes I'm a little bit sick of we are really clean in our process in Germany, but we buy the stuff from other countries where environmental restrictions are so much lower. So that's okay for me. But yes, the coal part is really, really tough. And at the same time, of course, we have a situation for the first time we see the dangers of this immense dependency on fossils. And the society as a whole could see it if they wanted, and most do. I mean, just today I biked to here in Schleswig-Holstein. I came, we have elections soon, and there was this one big poster saying, "Oh, is the energy price so high? So you really have to vote." And it was some right-wing party, Oh, you voted wrong if you think that the energy prices are so high. So there are still a lot of people around there who try to say, wow, the energy prices are high. That shows that renewables are rubbish. But I think a majority has understood that it's the fossils that are making these high energy prices. And so, yes, there is a chance now for energy efficiency, for renewables. None of this will be, or only a part of it will be ready next winter. But for 2030, we have a chance we've never had before. And as long as we use it, and I think climate-wise, the situation is okay, and maybe a little bit better than it was, because there is a certain clarity that was not there before.
Thank you.
But it really depends on what we do out of it now, and I'm not sure. As you mentioned, Scholz, our chancellor, a moment ago, I don't know, Marina, about his thoughts on during that speech on that Sunday morning. But of course, I think he is rather a politician who wants to reassure people. I let it that.
Thank you, Leon.
Marina, let me first, again, I'm a little bit outside my comfort zone, but I can't resist to comment. And I think we absolutely agree. I just want to add my frustration with the perceived fear of Germans, and I don't only blame the government. I think this goes beyond of contributing to an escalation. And I think you made it crystal clear why that's not the case. And it's quite the opposite, essentially. It's the lack of action that will increase the risk of future conflict. And again, I think we are back here is the underestimation or maybe even misunderstanding of the role of deterrence ahead of a crisis. I mean, the point is to avoid a next crisis and make this less likely. And this is why we need to make this crisis as expensive in any way as it can get for Vladimir Putin, because that's the only way we can achieve this. And Ingrid, let me join you with the kind of it's almost unbelievable, the lack of sense of urgency in policy, in the public, among journalists. So most people seem to believe the biggest problem is a price increase in gasoline by 15%, and they just don't realize. And it's absolutely sure, even if the crisis would stop today, we would see a massive increase in heating bills in the order of magnitude of 150%, 10 times more. And people just we're just walking into this year. And it won't be a surprise. These bills will come. And probably it will take until the end of next year when the extra payments are invoiced with a year of delay to most tenants, when this will only slowly sink into most brains. It's difficult to grasp. And Christian, let me comment on carbon pricing in the crisis. And this is something that I really spent a lot of time thinking about the past couple of days and weeks. Energy prices are too expensive. This is sort of, I think, a statement where probably everyone could agree. And the political intuition, what to do about this, is to make prices lower, to hand out energy subsidies to reduce their price level. And this is not a sort of a fringe argument, right? This is the narrative that might bring Marine Le Pen into office in just a few days. I mean, if she wins, then this is because of that argument. I'm not making predictions here, but this is the ticket that she's bringing. And funny enough, economically, this is exactly the opposite of what you should do. And let me explain. We are living in a moment of very inelastic, in particular, gas supply, natural gas. That means higher natural gas prices will not attract more supply. It will certainly not attract more Russian supply, and it would only attract very limited additional LNG. That means if you subsidize natural gas consumptions, as many governments are now planning or already have implemented, you will increase the consumption of gas. You will increase as a consequence, because supply is essentially fixed, the price, the wholesale price, because the wholesale price must rise and rise until the existing fixed supply matches the inflated demand, or demand is reduced enough to match that supply. So in the end, in that simple explanation, consumers will be exactly as good or bad off as before. They will not benefit from the subsidies. It will only be the suppliers. So it will be the Norwegians and Gazprom and the LNG suppliers that benefit from that policy. So quite counter the political intuition, what you should do in a moment of inelastic gas supply but high prices is tax the stuff and make it more expensive. And that, of course, could be a tax on gas, but it could also be carbon pricing. So funny enough, economically, because that will trigger the exactly reverse causality, right? So it will reduce assumption, it will then reduce the wholesale price for gas, and it will essentially not make consumers worse off. It will only make the suppliers worse off, Gazprom. But the gap between the economic argument and the political intuition is so huge that even people with a PhD in economics who perfectly well understand this, who work in ministries today, just say it's impossible for this to even communicate to the upper level of the administration, let alone members of parliament, let alone high profile politicians, and let alone the public. I mean, this is nothing that you
I
can
agree, Leon.
bring
It's
along.
impossible.
And I think the gap between economic theory and
That's not
political
part of
intuition,
democracy.
it's there quite often in many fields, but it's so stark here. And I do understand. So it's not that I blame here anyone. I don't want to be in a position to explain voters that the response to high natural gas prices is handing out a tax on natural gas. But I think it's important to repeat this, and it's important to say, economically speaking, this is the best time to implement carbon pricing, because carbon pricing is, of course, a tax on fossil fuels.
Thank you, Leon. So anecdotally, so I've received my new tax bill from the May forward. So it was 100 euros up to 30 at the end of this month. Actually, for 9 days, it's 100 euros per month. From 10 days on, it would be 400 euros per month. And be assured, I ordered my heat pump. On February 27th, I started exploring the options, basically because I wanted to start my private embargo. But of course, the economic incentive is also massive now, and more forward guidance on this would obviously be useful. It's probably not easy, but I think that's really something we have to do from politics, or even ask the energy providers to send forward guidance to consumers so that they really take this serious. Anyway. Let's turn to questions from the audience. So there are a couple in the F&A, and some are. One is particularly tailored to Marina. I think the question by Tilman Leicht: what's Germany's and Europe's best interest and strategic goal in Ukraine and Russia? So a pretty broad question. I think the perfect question for Marina to start with. And then the other questions look more like perhaps Leon could have a step at some of the more factual questions, and Ingrid then pick up on where she wants to. Marina, would you like to go first about the strategic goal question?
Yeah, well, I think as always, when you really look at, what are strategic interests and not necessarily normative interests, I think it's fairly simple. It's the security of Germany. It's security of, Europe, the European Union, the European Union's borders, if you want. And then the big question we have to ask, what is better, that then Putin wins, quote unquote, or loses in Ukraine? So what makes us safer? And here, I want to go back to what Leon just said. So I believe that if Putin takes away what he defines as a victory, but anyway, it's up to him to define this, and I think he can still set it up. The narrative of that he's saving these Russian speakers in Ukraine is something that is accepted, that is, as I mentioned before, reflected in the opinion polls. And so I think if he stays in power and can basically turn this Ukraine campaign in some kind of benefit to his presidency, I think we're actually much greater danger than if he quote unquote loses this war. Because so what can actually happen? And if he really feels cornered, yes, then he can take to more extreme measures. So, the most extreme would be some kind of tactical nuclear strike, or use chemical weapons and these kind of things. But I still think in the big picture of things, all of this, is fairly unlikely. And I don't think it will actually then escalate to a level where he will wage a war against NATO, as I mentioned before. I don't think that we are at this level. I don't think, there's a lot of discussion. Is Putin a strategic actor? Is he rational, non-rational? I think he's still fairly rational. I think the Ukraine campaign can be, from a domestic politics perspective, explained as a rational move with extreme preferences, but still it makes, to a certain degree, if he really wants to remain in power and needs to further strengthen this narrative on, NATO is my enemy. The opposition in Russia is funded, supported by NATO. That's why, we need to now defend ourselves in Ukraine. If this is what he's really going after, this entire invasion, to a certain degree, from this extreme preference setting makes sense. So long story short, I think Europe's, Germany's strategic interest is to remain safe. And I think, to do that, Putin needs to be defeated in Ukraine. And that's why we need to help right now to defeat Putin in Ukraine.
Thank you, Marina. Leon, I would almost like to leave it to you to pick among the questions rather than reading them out aloud, because I think you can sequence best.
Let me answer. Let me pick the easy ones that can be sort of answered relatively clearly with yes or no, or of numbers. So the first question I'm seeing here, and I think everyone has access to the question, right? By Richard, is about gas use in the summer. Roughly speaking, gas use by private households in the winter is 10 times higher than in the summer in Germany. That, of course, depends very much on the country. You could say that well-insulated modern houses, here the fraction of gas overall, much less energy is used for space heating and warm water, but the fraction of warm water is relatively sort of independent of the insulation, where the insulation very much determines the amount of energy used for space heating. So I think this is as specific as I can respond to this. There was another question about gas shipments and pipelines via Turkey. So I think it's pretty clear natural gas is not a long-term fuel that we would like to use any longer. And we would like to go for renewables, and there's very, very good climate and now very obvious security reasons to do this. The time it takes to build major pipeline projects is many years to several decades. So thinking about new pipeline projects, I think, is nothing that makes a lot of sense. We need to think about how to get as much natural gas into Europe from outside Russia in the next couple of years and months. And this will be through LNG, liquefied natural gas shipped on tankers. And then at the same time, we need to think about how can we reduce gas consumption as quickly as we can. And at the same time, in a more medium-term perspective over the next years and 10 years or so, how can we ramp up renewables as quickly as we can? But I would agree with Ingrid that we've pretty much used up. It's difficult to imagine a ramp up sort of that's quicker than what this government has set as goals. And maybe the last one that I'd like to pick out here is the question on, can nuclear energy partially reduce Germany's dependence on natural gas? The answer is yes. Every nuke that runs reduces the amount of electricity that's produced from natural gas and hence reduces imports from Russia. However, the leverage here is pretty small. Germany has shut down, I think, 4 reactors this beginning of this year, and there's another 3 reactors running, supposed to shut down the end of next year. If we extend this by a bit, we could save a few percentage of Germany's gas consumption, but not more. And the technical, legal, and political problems are pretty steep. So it's not a big. It's a small lever, not a big one. The big nuke question in Europe is, at least in fact at our neighbors to the west. In France, there is not less than 27 reactors. I repeat, 27 reactors shut down at the moment for safety reasons mostly. And this is the second biggest energy crisis in Europe, actually, the supply crisis of French nuclear power. And this is quite the opposite of a policy decision. This is showing how difficult and expensive it is to properly maintain such a huge fleet of nukes.
Thank you, Leon. Ingrid, would you like to go next?
Yes, maybe I can add a little bit on nukes and take up 3 other questions from the list. Actually, my understanding is that we really checked whether it would help us to have the nukes running longer. And this means a lot for a Green Party and a Green minister. Yeah, of course, you can always say, wow, I think you didn't do it properly. You didn't want to, you wanted the result to be no, as the result is no. But I think there was some real checking being done. And I mean, showing that we will not shut down the coal-fired power plants the moment we had planned to shut them down. It maybe shows that we're really checking every option. And I think what ruled it out in the end was that we couldn't get new Brennstoff, new uranium that was fit for the power plants to next winter. So pretty much all we could do was shift electricity from summer to winter, but not get extra electricity. And if we would then go to the winter afterwards, this would really mean, well, not using a lot of security measures that would need to be used, because all the security checks had already been postponed several years to say, wow, this is the end, you know, and we will switch them off anyway. Okay, so we don't do these security measures anymore. And if they would have to run another winter, well, our understanding is they would need to be done, which you know, would be, well, would take them out of work for a long time, and be a lot of work. 3 other questions I want to pick up on. One was, are there plans for thermostats to be lower or higher, depending on whether it's winter or summer, to really save energy? Personally, I can say absolutely yes. I have lots of ideas in my head what we could do. I think we could say that for office buildings, there should be a law that says temperature in the rooms should be no higher than 20 degrees Celsius. I think that would be fine. And the big companies, at least, they would not breach the law. They would do it. It's more difficult for private houses because nobody would check what temperature it is in the private houses. And then there are more different situations there than just office situations. But at least you could allow the house owners to have the temperature lower, because at the moment there's a law saying that they have to keep the heating system so that it's 22 degrees everywhere. We're discussing a lot about intelligent thermostats that can be fixed to the windows, for example, so that when the window opens, the heating turns off. And actually, the experts tell me that there's quite a big potential of maybe 10-15% gas to be saved. And that is a lot, because the heating sector is such a huge consumption. And yes, we have lots of ideas, but I cannot really promise how much of them will be really worked on, or will be finished, will be on the street, on the road in summer, because we're doing so many things at the same time. And none of this has been prepared, you know. I mean, there have been programs already to have, for example, serial conservation, heat energy conservation on the buildings, but they're still in a very slow process. No really fast track measures have been prepared, and they're working on that in the ministry. And we have to see where we end up in 4 or 8 weeks there. Heat pumps, well, yes, there's also the planning to speed up on heat pumps. But I have to say, in a moment when we are using the old coal-fired power plants to make electricity, I mean, it's climate-wise kind of ouch. And still it makes sense to install them now, because we have good chances to have cleaner electricity in 2030. But if you install heat pumps, please have a heat storage as well, so that at least you can take the electricity from the times when there's lots of wind and sun, and not from other times, because electricity is actually also scarce. When there's nothing we have really in abundance at the moment. Last point I wanted to pick up on was if there are any ideas that we could buy together as Europeans, or as maybe generally LNG consumers worldwide, to get prices down. I think this is an interesting track, and maybe Leon, that's where we disagree, or I have a little bit a different outlook on what you said before, because you said we should tax now. It must be expensive so that consumers will consume less, that we get consumption down. Actually, I would rather have lower gas prices than we are having at the moment, and I'm not sure that the theory really works here, that the prices are the best mechanism to get consumption down. I think we could pay, you know, those industry that could really turn down consumption. I mean, shut down production entirely. We could pay them for doing that. We wouldn't need to have a huge gas price in the entire market. And as we've seen before, the biggest consumption part, the building sector, they don't even see the high prices, but only with a huge time lag. And even then, all this lump sum payment to people, it will not work because the bills are so different. And I just know that politics will not. We will not be able to stand it if these prices really arrive at the household level. I think we have to get consumption down, but I think we have to find faster measures to do it, and also those where we can allow for certain parts of industry to keep running that we really need.
Christian, if you may let me quickly respond to the last point Ingrid raised, and also pick up one more question from the chat. So I think the question of high prices arriving at the household level is not a when, it's not an if, it's just a when, because it's not like if prices are high in the winter, then the households will feel the heat. It's the retailers that supply the households buy natural gas at the moment at the high prices. So even if, let's say, by November, this all turns out to be just a nightmare and prices go back to 15 euros for natural gas on the wholesale market, we would still see a price increase for retail tariffs in the order of 100% or so. So it's sort of, I think I would go as far to say it's almost absolutely sure that we're going to see an incredibly price spike at the gas retail price level, almost not independent of what happens in the Ukraine, but even if things would evaporate and problems would just disappear, it would still, it's already happening. It has already happened. These suppliers have already spending now 3/4 of the year buying gas at a very high price, and they must pass this on to their own customers. And
yeah, but too late to be a perfect trigger for consumption reductions. We must find a faster trigger than that.
I agree that this is a problem. I've been thinking a lot about, can't we tell households more clearly what they face? I mean, this is essentially
what? I've just been thinking about whether I could use the clarity of your words to give them to the media tomorrow, because I'm really worried about
I think
people
again,
not realizing it.
The political and the economic intuition is quite the opposite, right? For politicians, and because they face voters, they'd like to hide the price increase as long as they can. And economists would say you need to proactively and sort of communicate this ahead of time so households have a chance to respond. But I do understand the political cost of doing so. Let me try to answer one question from the chat, because I missed it earlier, by Laura. Is there a plan B for the supply of natural gas to the EU towards what's happening into Russia? So why is switching from Russia to other suppliers so difficult? Essentially because you can use existing pipelines to pump gas, especially from Norway to Europe, but the supply from Norway is already at its limits, and there is no big other suppliers with pipeline gas. Then you can use liquefied natural gas, but there's 3 constraints to this. First, the terminals that you need to regasify the gas coming into Europe, so the import bridge essentially, is limited. Second, LNG markets globally are pretty tight. So LNG is used in East Asia at very high prices, and there is just very little room to increase global LNG supply, if any. And third, the LNG terminals are predominantly located in Western and Southern Europe. So Spain has 25% of European LNG import capacity, but has hardly any pipeline connection to the rest of the country. So we could easily supply Spain with LNG, but we can't use the Spanish LNG imports to supply anything, pretty much any other European country except Portugal. So this is why it's so difficult.
Thank you, Leon. So there are 2 unanswered questions in the F&A. One is, will this energy crisis accelerate Europe and Germany's transition to renewable energy? I guess the answer is yes. I guess that's what the EU Commission has proposed. And I was a bit critical about sort of synergies and trade-offs and fears about how climate policy will be adversely affected by current developments. But one thing that I do feel confident about, and I haven't been before, is that, for example, the energy transition in the building sector, I can now see it happening, and I can see complete decarbonization happening in the next 10, 15 years, I couldn't see it 1 year ago, to be honest, how that politically would work out, given the huge obstacles. I now think there's a different case and the political chance that we will actually do this to wean ourselves off gas in particular. And that, I think this is a strong push towards this transformation and politically a synergy. I may be wrong, but I guess the problem, first of all, the problem is here to stay and it will not go away quickly, in terms of problem being Russia and the energy market relations. And the other is the vulnerability shock, even if not taken in fully yet, I think is here and will be remembered, and it will be a strong impetus for developing policy further in this field. Perhaps the one question that is open before we come to a final round, the joint procurement question, joint EU procurement on gas on world markets to avoid competition, which drives up prices, and Robert Habeck going to Qatar, etc. Perhaps Ingrid, perhaps do you want to respond to that question? How do you see the political chances that we get EU coordination on this? The idea has been around for a long time. The EU Commission.
That's the one I tried to answer in the end when I started the nice discussion with Leon. That I like this idea, and I think there is a certain. I mean, it takes some time. I would like quicker measures to get prices down, but I think there's a certain probability that it can work, and I quite like it. Yeah, that's what I try to say with, yes, I would like the prices to be a little bit lower.
Mm-hmm. And what are the main challenges to that in your view, politically, to do that such joint procurement? What is keeping us from doing
many
it?
Countries with different political problems and different people who have their own, you have to get them together. Usually this is a process that takes quite some time, but I think the question there was the COVID vaccines were mentioned. So yes, I think we really should learn from the COVID crisis now. I mean, we made some mistakes there, for example, to always forget that fall will come. And we should not make this mistake this time. We have a summer, and yes, the winter will come, and we should use the time. But we also have seen that a lot of things work, that people really can change their behavior if they are told that it is necessary, not a nice to have. That we can really procure things where we have no industrial production capacities in the beginning, but we can ramp it up really fast if we want it. I mean, these vaccines didn't even exist before, and now there's millions and millions produced. We have seen, that we can put resources, and we have seen that we can have international action. And we should put the same urgency into this issue. Actually, I think we should even put more urgency into it. Just, I don't see it happening as yet.
Okay, so that's sort of the framing of the final round that I would like to do, because you've all mentioned the sense of urgency or the lack of sense of urgency as you perceive it in the different fields, energy policy, perhaps still to some extent security policy. I mean, social policy is another field we haven't really touched upon, but the energy price rises and political fears there also constrain the room for maneuver in security policy, right? But given this, so two questions. The first is, what do you think we can do to enhance the sense of urgency? And the big question is, who's we here? Well, us, but also those in the audience. And who do you think are the main actors to do something here beyond ministers who are obvious addressees of this kind of question? Media, perhaps also institutional changes, I don't know, crisis task force in government. Is that something that might help? Just any thoughts you have or proposals to speed up actions, enhance urgency, enhance awareness, private sector action, perhaps, I don't know, social entrepreneurship to start campaigns on these issues. Any thoughts you would have, I'd be very curious about those. And perhaps to combine that with the question I had in mind, which is what sort of keeps you, I hope it doesn't, but it keeps you awake at night about like concerns for the next year, the next 5 years, when you look at this crisis, or even the next weeks. What are really the major threats or imminent issues that you perceive in this situation of the Ukrainian war or the Russian war in Ukraine, energy policy, climate policy, or any other concern you have these days related to these developments? I'd be very curious about your number one priority issue here. So measures to deal with the urgency, and second, your main concern right now. And first we do the order we had before, starting with Marina, then Leon and Ingrid.
Hey, well, thank you so much for your amazing, input, Ingrid and Leon. I learned so much. I'm not, at all an expert in the energy field, and I have a look at my gas bill for sure. No, but I was already expecting an increase. But just to say that you got me a little bit frightened. But to the questions Christian just mentioned. So I think two things I would like to say. The first big thing is like urgency. So, and I will stay in my field of expertise, and that's security and defense policy. I must say that, like since the end of the Cold War, an entire generation grew up in Germany, and to a certain degree, I'm part of it, that became incredibly complacent. And I see it, still every single day, often also among students. There's the idea war happens somewhere else, but not in Europe, and it will never ever touch Germany again. And I think this is just a realization that needs to come home, and I think it has slowly come home. But I'm a little bit worried that once some kind of stalemate or some kind of slow-paced counterinsurgency war happens in Ukraine, that again this attitude comes back and says now Ukraine is done, and we can fall back in this kind of complacency mindset that we have had since basically the 1990s. And I think that's unfortunately quite dangerous. So I think what's up to us, educators, but of course also in our media presence and so forth, is just like to say that unfortunately in this world there have always been and there will always be actors who believe that the use of force is to their benefit, and these actors who think that the physical force they have, they exist in our societies, they exist in schools, they exist everywhere, that these are bully types. They compare their assets that they have, and they think that their physical strength, or this translated to the government level, that's military capabilities, that this is their asset compared to economic assets or cultural assets or soft power assets. And it will always be a reality, and we need to be prepared. And I think, we have to prevent that this mindset gets forgotten. What really keeps me up at night is that the Ukrainian people really suffer right now. And to a certain degree, they're suffering to keep us safe. They're the front line, what Zelensky and various other Ukrainian peoples are saying, that they're fighting for the freedom and, the values of Europe, is true. Because if Putin had an easy success in Ukraine, I think he would be somewhere else by now. And that means, as I mentioned before, threatening Moldova, but maybe even the Baltic states. So the fact that they slowed down this campaign under extreme human suffering is something that we need to be grateful for. And, but that keeps me up at night because I know how they suffer. I was myself hosting Ukrainian refugees here in Berlin. I know that the human tragedy of these decisions to leave everything you have, often in hours, and now see your loved ones still fighting or maybe even being wounded, had died. I think that's the tragedy of it. And again, to not fully be aware of these incredibly hard decisions that these people make, I think is something that I'm scared and I'm worried that people will forget too quickly.
Thank you, Marina. Leon, would you go next?
I must admit that's what keeps me up at night is not energy policy, and it's not even grading final exams. Not these days. It's very much the same pictures that Marina described. So literally, I spent this last weeks often awake thinking of the incredible suffering of all these humans in besieged cities. But I'm well aware that sort of my place in this debate is in energy. This is where what I believe to be a sidetrack of this crisis, but where my expertise is, where I can say something. And I think, and Ingrid put it well before, I believe, it's sort of the ultimate decision makers in the decision to use up energy is predominantly private individuals, right? It's households, it's persons it's governments can sort of facilitate this, but ultimately we need to use less energy, and every kilowatt hour we don't use is a good kilowatt hour. How do we get there? Well, I always try to bring the message across whenever I speak publicly to just the audience. So please go home and turn down your heat and keep it turned down as long as you can. Every day helps. And try to inform people about the possibilities they have through behavioral changes, which is huge in the case of space heating at home. And then remind people that even if you don't think this is useful, you will avoid some of the very nasty price spikes that you're going to see. So this is not only in the interest of the grand scale of things, but it is also in the very personal interest of everyone. And I hope those who are not convinced by geopolitics are convinced by the threat of the Nebenkostennachzahlung, as Germans get it.
Thank you, Leon. Ingrid.
This sounds like such a technical word, and it will mean so much to a lot of people in the short term. Well, what can we do? I think clarity of speech from top-level politicians can help. To procure information, just as Leon said now, how to save energy. I still feel talking to people who say, oh yes, they want to do something, that the first impetus is to switch off lights, which is nice, but you know, the clothes dryer can easily use 100 times the electricity than a light bulb does. Nowadays, the light bulbs have become very efficient. And people just don't have this information, I think. I quite like that that already 2 industrial branches have offered to really help spread this information among all the people who work there. And I think this is good because we can reach other people than usual green energy campaigns. I think we should, in the industrial sector, hand out money for demand reductions. I like the idea of, I don't know if it really works in the end. You know, we are having lots of ideas, and probably out of 10, only 3 will work, and we do not yet know which, but we still have to push them all, so find 3 that will work. I like it that everybody gets €100 for easy saving technology. You know, it could be the insulation foil on the window, or a better fridge, or the thermostat, intelligent thermostat in your heating, whatever. So that people start thinking about it, and they start doing these little things that help a lot. I think actually we should have a clear call of solidarity with people who are dependent on their cars, and say to people who just use their cars for fun, or could easily go with their bike or on a train, to say, hey, this is really scarce, this is driving up prices, this is really getting people into trouble who depend on their cars. We need more solidarity. So think about what group do you belong to. I love to ramp up insulation, especially the serial insulation, really fast. I mean, just like we did with vaccines, but also administrative decisions, like, for example, in Schleswig-Holstein, where I'm at the moment, both the Minister for Energy and the Minister for Planning, home, my English is failing me, they wrote together a letter to every local authorities saying, please speed up decision making, administrative decisions for renewable energies. You know, we need this to all help together. Okay, it's already 8:02, so I make a cut here. Yeah, what keeps me awake is the fear that we are losing time that we need, not being able to do everything at the same time. I'm rather worrying about the mistakes we're doing today than the mistakes that we very definitely did in the past. Yes, or that we might be doing. I hope we're not doing them, but yes, that keeps me awake to try to avoid them.
Thank you, Ingrid, and thank you, Marina, and thank you, Leon. While I hope everybody in the end sleeps well, because we need the energy to think about during the day about the best we can do about this crisis and others. I'd like to thank you very much for your thoughtful inputs. It was really interesting to me. I'd like to thank our participants for their questions and engagement with this discussion. And the discussion will be online in case you want to share with someone else. Have a nice evening, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again and discuss these matters, because I think this is not going to be over quickly. For now, thank you and bye-bye.